Lindsay Owens is a sociologist and the executive director for the Groundwork Collaborative, a progressive economics think tank. Her work has been published in leading social science journals, including Brookings' paper on economic activity, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and Social Forces. She teaches at Georgetown University and is the co-creator and co-instructor of America's Poverty course, online now at Stanford University. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Lindsay Owens.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome indeed, Lindsay. And David might have added that you have experience on Capitol Hill. You were legislative director to Congressman Keith Ellison and Progressive Caucus Chair Pramila Jayapal, among other roles. So, listeners, we've got a very experienced person here making a point that's long overdue, that corporate pricing strategies, they use that actually on their shareholder calls that they've had. One quote was a successful pricing strategy, end quote. That's about as close to an admission of monopolistic power as they're willing to admit. And until Lindsay had her op-ed in the New York Times, the Republicans were having an opportunity to blame the Democrats for rising prices and inflation. I'm not aware that the Democratic Party is a vendor of food and energy and pharmaceuticals, nor is the White House. So she's setting the record straight. And you started your column, Lindsay, by saying you participate in a lot of shareholder calls by management to see how they talk. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so look, Americans are getting squeezed by rising prices at the grocery store, at the gas pump, really across the board. And corporations are bringing in record profit margins, the highest we've seen since 1970. And we wanted to understand how that's the case. In theory, those profit margins should be eaten into by the rising costs of labor, by the rising costs of materials. But actually, the margins were expanding. And so we went to the horse's mouth. We listened to hundreds of earnings calls, talking to their investors about their quarterly earnings, about sales and revenue and profits. And we heard a lot about the supply chain, a lot about inflation, a lot about profits, as you do on earnings calls. But we also heard a lot of, what I would call sort of plain old profiteering. We heard a lot of crowing and boasting, frankly, about how CEOs could use the cover that this moment provided, the cover of inflation, the cover of foreign war in the Ukraine, the cover of the pandemic, to really gild the lily, to pass along those rising costs, but then to go for more. And the go for more is how they're driving up those profit margins.
In this cover of inflation point you make, you quote the head of research for Barclays Bank saying, quote, the longer inflation lasts and the more widespread it is, the more air cover it gives companies to raise prices, end quote. Air cover? What is all that about?
Yeah, I think there are some norms in our society around pricing. Consumers get used to prices for goods that they buy over and over again. And, they get a bit scared off when they see price increases. And typically folks try to keep pricing similar and sort of build profit in other ways. So, before you have supply shortages, you had companies driving profit by trying to pick up more market share, right? And in a world of supply shortages, you can't really do that. And so instead, you drive profit through price. And what this moment has done is sort of unlocked the ability to raise prices because there are consumer expectations that prices are increasing. So, the CEO of Hostess Snack Foods, who I talk about in the piece, says, look, it's easier for us to raise prices right now because everybody else is doing it. And consumers sort of start to expect it. So, firms are not going to miss this moment to take pricing that they've maybe sort of wanted to take for decades. Maybe they've been flirting with for a while. They're going big. One of the other things we've noticed, which I think does not bode well for this sort of slowdown of inflation, is some of the CEOs we've been listening in on are saying, look, actually our costs are coming down, but we're not going to pass on those savings. We're going to stick with the new low price, the new higher price. Consumers are getting used to it, and we're not planning on giving any of that pricing back.
Well, the one thing in your column in the New York Times that really stood out for me was the following. I'm going to quote you. Despite the rising costs of labor, energy, and materials, Profit margins reached 70-year highs in 2021. And according to an analysis from the Economic Policy Institute, fatter profit margins, not the rising costs of labor and materials, drove more than half of price increases in the non-financial corporate sector since the start of the COVID pandemic, end quote. The impression they're trying to give in the corporate propaganda is that we're paying labor more, we're paying more for energy. What do you expect us to do? And what you're saying is they're going way, way beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, this new data from the Economic Policy Institute is really a smoking gun. We obviously have corporation CEOs saying the quiet part out loud in broad daylight on the earnings calls, but it's really nice to have the kind of the definitive numbers. And so, what they found at the Economic Policy Institute is typically from about 1979 to 2019, labor costs accounted for about 62% of growth in unit prices. Right now, and this is in the non-financial corporate sector, so we're not talking about the financial markets here, we're talking about stuff you can hold in your hands. So about 62% historically. From Q2 of 2020 to the end of 2021, unit labor costs only contributed 8% to the rising prices. So this is not a story of, oh, I got to pay my workers more, I got to pass that along, or I'm going to go bankrupt. A typical kind of scapegoat for inflation. People love to blame workers and workers' wages, but that is just not what the data show. If anything, unit labor costs accounting for a historically low percentage of the price increases. What's accounting for a historically high percentage, and really what's sort of making up that entire difference, is corporate profits used to be about 11% of that increase. And now, as you mentioned, 54%. So more than half of the rise in prices that we're seeing is coming from what firms call the markup, right? That's the portion it's the juice on top of passing along your sort of break-even costs. So, I mean, it's just a stunning reversal of sort of the normal status quo standard operating procedure during a moment of national crisis, during a moment of mass death, a moment of foreign war, and a moment in which Americans are looking at prices they haven't seen, in 40 years.
Well, just recently, Jeff Bezos of Amazon took issue with Joe Biden's mild comments on corporate profits. And he sort of indicated that Biden should mind his own business. But it turns out that Amazon pays only 6% income tax. So the reduction in income tax loopholes, tax havens, tax escapes also is leading to higher net profits, isn't it? 6%, imagine, the giant Amazon company on $33 billion in profits, 6%. What role are reduced taxes? That's true across the board. I mean, most large corporations, they average about 8%. Some don't pay any for a year or two. So talk about the role of the tax reduction.
Yeah, look, if your profits are not going to get taxed, why not go as hard and fast as you can? And that's what we're seeing, right? Drive up the price, bring in the profits, ship it back to your shareholders in buybacks. Then if you're the CEO, wait for the stock price to bump after you announce the buybacks and sell some of your shares, right? I think, a higher corporate tax rate, or we've advocated also for an excess profits tax, which we've had, numerous times throughout modern history, I think makes profiteering a lot less lucrative. It disincentivizes some of that profiteering that we're seeing, some of the price gouging that we're seeing. It's not very fun to price gouge if you got to ship your winnings over to the Treasury Department. So I absolutely think Biden is exactly right. Tax has got to be part of the solution here. And it's not surprising that Bezos isn't interested in that one, right? The status quo is working pretty well for him.
Well, I'm sure some of our listeners are wondering what can be done about all this. Before we get to what could be done, there's some interesting information from Lindsay about what state laws already are in the books can do about price gouging. I just wanted to have you range beyond mere taking advantage of the situation of these corporations, because there are all kinds of clever ways that corporations managed to gouge consumers long before the pandemic and Ukraine war. And one of them it's been documented by this group, Consumer Watchdog, in California, which is the manipulation by the 4 refineries in California. Imagine 4 refineries have a giant market there, that they shut down for repairs for an inordinate amount of time. And if one of them shuts down for an inordinate amount of time, the price of gasoline goes up in California. When the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska occurred and there was a temporary shortage, the price of ExxonMobil's gas stations went up in terms of gasoline. They actually made more than what they had to pay out for that spill. Talk about these idiosyncratic ways that drug companies, patent monopolies, all kinds of things that make a mockery of market fundamentalism and the free market discipline.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a total mockery. Folks like to think that CEOs are efficient stewards of scarce resources. You learn in Econ 101, they're just raising prices, responding to supply shortages to bring supply back in line with demand. But the truth is that's really a fiction. In sort of sector after sector, we see firms actively throttling supply to bring up price. And it's really typical in oil. Great example from a Texas-based oil company, Pioneer Oil. A couple days after Russia invades the Ukraine, journalists asked the CEO of Pioneer, look, crude oil price is going up. What price will put you back in the ground? It seems like you can make a lot of money. And he said, there's no price that would have me pull up another barrel of crude. And the journalist said, well, why is that? And he said, the shareholders own this company. That's a quote. And they want a return of cash. That's another quote. We see it in oil where they're throttling supply to keep the prices high and bring in record profits. We've seen it actually in the housing sector. A couple of housing developers that we listened in on, publicly traded developers, saying, yeah, we could have built another 1,000 units this quarter, another 1,000 houses, but markup's really good for us right now. So we didn't. And we just brought in the extra profit off the scarcity, right? People were willing to pay. And we've seen it in a variety of other sectors. The scarcity and the fact that these companies have so much control, so much pricing power, in many cases really stems from their relative monopoly positions in the market, right? If you don't have any fear of being undercut by the competition, why not take this as far as you can go in this moment?
Well, we've been talking with Lindsay Owens, who's the executive director of the Groundwork Collaborative in Washington, D.C. There's another quote from your column, I think sets the stage for what you want to tell us about these price gouging statutes that are on the books in the states and what's going on in Congress. Let me quote it. Quote, on the other side of the debate are a majority of Americans, including me, who look at the economy and see businesses exploiting supply chain bottlenecks, foreign war, and a pandemic to bring in record profits on the backs of consumers. We don't dispute that the system is working well for Fortune 500 companies and Wall Street investors, but we want lawmakers to stop the profiteering that has gone too far, end quote. The factor of limitless greed is obviously operating throughout history in terms of the merchant class, and now we call it the large corporations. They deliberately take advantage of powerless people. That's why they rip off blacks, Hispanics when they're poor, minorities. They take advantage of people with disabilities by jacking up prices on prosthetic devices. I mean, the cruelty is beyond belief here. And now they're taking advantage of everybody because they can get away with it. There's an alleged infant formula shortage now. There are only 4 companies in the U.S. producing it. Abbott produces 40% or more out of their factories in Michigan. Well, there is a contamination problem. Last fall, some infants fell sick, a couple died, stemming directly from Abbott Labs' lack of quality control in their factory. And here's the comparison that points to this greed. Abbott's management refused to repair the dilapidated drying machines, which turned the plant into a breeding ground for Chronobacter, because they used the $5.73 billion they had for stock buybacks. I mean, a tiny fraction of that money could have cleaned up that plant and saved those little infants and avoided this so-called infant formula shortage. So the varieties of corporate greed are endless. And we're living in an era in the U.S. of low regulation, non-regulation, unenforced laws against corporate crime, fraud, and abuse, enormous rip-offs in the healthcare industry, drug prices are sky high, protected by government subsidies and the patent system. You've got a little bit of optimism in your article on the state's price gouging statutes and what's going on in Congress. Can you give us a description of that, Lindsay?
Yeah, so you're exactly right on the baby formula piece. It's really tempting, I think, to blame this moment on the pandemic or to think of it as a sort of aberration, a pandemic-induced aberration. But the truth is this sort of knife-edge supply chain that we're all living in is really decades in the making, decades of offshoring, of mergers and acquisitions, building an economy that has very little redundancy, very little duplication, where we're quite vulnerable to one firm being knocked out, in this case, because of their own sort of malpractice and negligence. But it was true when we got to the eve of the pandemic without a semiconductor to spare. We just don't make them in the United States anymore. And that's a real issue if you need to produce more cars. So the system that we're living in, and the short-termism you point out with the buybacks, we didn't always have buybacks. Reagan undid Great Depression era laws around barring the manipulation of stock prices. And when he undoes that, it unleashes the buyback era that we're living in and the focus on short-term profits over capital investments like those Abbott needed to desperately make in their assembly line to keep baby formula moving. So I think it's just important to note that this is, really decades in the making. The question of what we can do about it, I think there are a few things. 38 states have some form of price gouging statutes on the books. They kick in and are triggered by different things. Sometimes it's natural disasters, sometimes it's pandemic and public health emergency. But those laws are there because lawmakers in the majority of states have decided it's not in the public interest for corporations to be able to run up the score in times of crisis. And I think we're really overdue for a federal price gouging statute that says, look, moments of pandemic, natural disasters, and frankly, periods of economic transition, economic uncertainty should not be moments where corporations can go for broke on pricing. And I think giving the Federal Trade Commission and other key regulatory authorities the ability to crack down on it, and frankly, the mere presence of a law like that, I think is a real deterrent. The lawyers at these big Fortune 500 companies are going to say, hey, don't take this too far. You're going to catch the eye of the FTC. And so I think a law like that makes a lot of sense in this moment. And we may not be able to get it done. It may not have an impact on this current crisis, but this is really a dress rehearsal. These supply chain snarls, they're going to be coming for us as climate change bears down. Trade routes will be disrupted, plants will be flooded, crops will be burnt and flooded. We're going to see this again. This is not the last time we're going to see this. So I think putting some new laws in place to try to prohibit this type of just outrageous price gouging is really critical for Congress to take on.
You mentioned that there's something going on in Congress about restoring the tradition of taxing excess profits.
Yeah, so just in the last month, there's really been a sort of renaissance of focus on excess profits. I think there are now maybe 4 proposals in the House and Senate to tax excess profits. So the idea here is, look, you pay the regular tax rate, which is already quite low, on your sort of everyday profits based on the sort of historical average that you might have, whether that's 10% or 13%. And then you're going to pay more. You're going to pay a higher rate on your excess profits, on the profits that you're generating because of your market position in this moment, your monopoly position, because of your ability to exploit a crisis that's not of your making, like a war abroad. So, we used them in World War I, World War II, the Korean War. We had an excess profits tax in, as recently as 1981 for oil and gas. And it's a lot less lucrative to price gouge if to keep all of the profits. So I think it's a really smart approach. And, a number of folks are considering proposals right now.
And even the White House Council of Economic Advisors foresaw more of this whenever there's floods or disruptive trade routes. They take advantage of it and jack up the price.
Absolutely. Yeah. They put out their sort of annual report to the president and warned about the supply chain disruptions that we're likely to face in the future. this is not a pandemic aberration. I think it's a harbinger of what's to come. One thing we didn't talk about is the shipping cartel. I mean, the shipping cartel is a real impediment to bringing prices down. There are three major shipping alliances that control between 80 and 95% of the trade routes. And they're looking at, there was one quarter where their profits increased over 1,000%, and they're seeing the highest profits in, over 110 years. So a lot of the goods that are coming in, there's just this huge tax being imposed by the shipping companies who know they have really everyone over a barrel right now.
Can you tell our listeners how they can reach you, Lindsay? We've been talking with Lindsay Owens, the executive director of the Groundwork Collaborative, and how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Owens, Owens, Lindsay, Lindsay 1, and through our website, www.groundworkcollaborative.org.
Well, our time is up, unfortunately. We've been talking with Lindsay Owens, Executive Director of the Groundwork Collaborative. She's a burst of new energy in the civic community in Washington, D.C. And does the civic community ever need a burst of energy? So keep at it, Lindsay. Swarm yourself over Capitol Hill, shake those people up, and remind them where they're coming from. Back home, where the people have to pay all the bills, and they have given the Congress such enormous amounts of their sovereign power under the Constitution. Thank you and good luck.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a real honor to get a chance to talk with you today.
Yeah, Lindsay, I just wanted to ask, this may sound like a stupid layman's question. How do you get to listen in to these earnings calls?
We all can. You can too. So companies sort of alert you to when the earnings call is going to be. You can't ask a question. I can't ask a question. That's reserved for sort of market analysts. But shareholders can listen in, market analysts can listen in, and the public can listen in. The other thing is, after the call, the transcripts and sometimes the audio is also made available. And so, a bit easier to read through them than it is to listen to them, but sometimes fun to listen because you get a sense of the tone. And I'll tell you, man, the tone of these, it's like kids bringing home straight A report cards, right? I mean, these guys are coming to their shareholders and they're like, hey, look at us. Look what we did. Look what my team did. We've done a marvelous job raising prices. And, and the result is profits. And oh, by the way, your reward is buybacks.
Wow.
Well, the problem with these CEOs and the high management is they're completely isolated from the travails affecting ordinary people. I mean, they're in their own silos, mansions, yachts. They don't know what to do with their money. And so the monetization of their minds takes over and leads to incredible greed. And so they got to be called out, whether it's, on a radio talk show. I mean, they got to get feedback from their PR people that there's a rumble from the people out there, and they're not going to take it anymore. And then they come down to earth. So apart from price gouging statutes being enforced more and excess profits, the outcry from the public tends to get to them. They realize, they've gone too far, and they're facing a rebellion among the customers that make all their profits possible. It's just another way of saying to our listeners, speak out, make your point, protest, send emails. The PR people for these big companies have tender antennas, and to make their job more important, they will feed back the outcries from the public, because that's what they're supposed to be doing. So, David, how about a comment from you?
Yeah, thank you. Lindsay, Ralph has taught us about Robert Bork, who literally wrote the book on how our Justice Department should enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. He wrote the Antitrust Paradox in 1978. And from that book, the Justice Department has pretty much been instructed not to break up cartels unless those cartels have an adverse effect on consumer welfare. Is inflation an adverse effect on consumer welfare? And if so, couldn't Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, right now fix this price gouging?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the most important and efficient policy solutions that the Biden administration has at their disposal is enforcing the laws already on the books. And I think the Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division, as well as the Federal Trade Commission have a role to play in taking this on. I think There are a couple of sort of obvious candidates here. The big four meat packers have locked up between 50 and 85% of the market, depending on the type of meat, chicken or pork or beef. Tyson, one of the big four, saw sales drop last quarter and still brought in more profit, right? So, this is just the enviable position of having that much market share. Not coincidentally, they also are under intense scrutiny by regulators for wage fixing across those big four meat packers. So they're not only sort of colluding to keep prices high, they're also colluding to keep wages low. This looks tempting to sort of think that the world and the economy looks like your economics 101 textbook. But when you look at these big four meat packers, it looks like an episode of The Sopranos. One of the Brazilian companies, JBS, these guys just got out of jail for sort of bribery with the former president of Brazil. And they're back at it, price fixing and price gouging in the meat industry in this moment. And, we're seeing their family members join the sort of Forbes world's richest folks. So yeah, there are some really obvious examples where this pricing power does stem from market power. And there we should be looking at price fixing, at collusion, at tacit collusion, and at wage fixing. And you're right, DOJ can do that today, and the Federal Trade Commission can too.
So it's a leadership problem. It's a leadership problem.
We've heard mumblings that they are looking into it and sort of taking it on. I know the Department of Justice and the Department of Agriculture have created some sort of partnerships to try to make sure that the information the Department of Agriculture is getting about folks in the food industry around consolidation is getting to DOJ so they can take a look at it. But unfortunately, it takes a little bit of time. We let the system get to where it is, and it's really a perfect storm. It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle here.
As you say, there's a structural long-term problem here, Lindsay. Around the country, there are people who are able to do self-help. They form consumer co-ops. There's a lot of consumer co-ops being formed where they own their own food store and have bargaining power. Some of them are starting vegetable gardens, all kinds of backyards of people who start vegetable gardens and growing their own crops the way Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked Americans to do in World War II, and millions of vegetable gardens suddenly started getting grown. Not everybody can do this, obviously, but those consumers who can generate their own sub-economy. They can reduce the demand for these gouging products and often get better quality and have a sense of empowerment. And anything else you want to say?
No, I think you're exactly right. Necessity is the mother of invention. And, Americans are getting quite innovative in this moment. My view is that we have a responsibility to change the structure so that folks don't have to exercise personal responsibility to get a fair deal in this country. But we are hearing that ranchers and, in Nebraska and South Dakota are forming co-ops as well and trying to get the meat directly to market rather than going through these giant middlemen who aren't just hiking up prices for consumers, they're squeezing the ranchers as well.
Did you get a good reaction to your New York Times piece, or did you get any reaction?
Yeah, I did get a really good reaction. I think, we got a lot of positive feedback from folks on the Hill. Congress is working on this week. They're sort of trying to take on price gouging in oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
There's a floor vote in the House. Got a lot of great comments from readers, particularly readers, who are small business owners who are watching this play out firsthand. Mm-hmm. And then we definitely got the sort of good reaction that you get when you make the right people angry.
Right.
So if you count that as a positive reaction, I think we angered the kind of, that sort of like Beltway neoliberal want class and some of our sort of Larry Summers and Jason Furman economist tape.
By the way, Lindsay, get in touch with Consumer Watchdog. Jamie Court, Court. Okay. They've done a lot of work on these refineries.
I would love to. By the way, we started this work last August because, it just smelled fishy, right? These profit numbers kept coming in, the prices were ticking up. But around February, we sort of, you start doing this work and you meet people who think the same way, right? It's quite actually controversial to think that firms matter in pricing decisions. Macroeconomists don't believe that, right? They think firms are what's called price takers. But I got in touch with a historian who sent me a pamphlet, a PDF of a pamphlet from Coin. And I started looking into it and I saw this like 1978 Washington Post exclusive on Coin, and you were quoted in it. And it was so interesting for me to see, because in some ways I was like, oh God, we just reinvented the wheel, with this work. It's like they were doing it all in 1978. I should have read it 6 months ago. We could have gotten a jump start. But I saw you guys were taking on the big agriculture, you were taking on oil. I mean, with Public Citizen and Consumer Federation of America and the unions, which, by the way, not surprisingly, because, the labor movement has been, whittled away since 1978. Like, the unions have been totally silent on inflation, right? We haven't heard a peep from labor sort of publicly about how inflation is really, this profiteering is really eroding the wage gains that folks are able to get in a tight labor market. But when you reached out, I was so delighted, because I already have been thinking of this work as sort of carrying on the tradition of Coin. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, nice point. Thank you. I remember Proxmire was desperately trying to save the Excess Profits Commission that would impose excess profits on, military contracts. And they got rid of that. He lost the support of his own Democratic Party on that.
Yeah.
That was a government commission just to focus on excess profit defense contracts. So it's good to bring back some of that history.
And you guys had a meeting with Carter, I think. Biden, like the idea that Biden would, he's flirted with this. Like we sent him all that we had on the meat packers, and he did kind of a Department of Agriculture did a press conference like in early September. And then the blowback from the kind of economic gatekeepers was really aggressive, and they kind of chickened out. And then the holidays came around, and obviously the political pressure was mounting, right? People were talking about empty shelves and not being able to get gifts for their kids, and gas prices were up. And so around Thanksgiving, he hit again and directed the FTC to look at the big retailers and the big oil companies. And then he got hit again by the kind of like wonks, and they kind of went back into their shell. And then, he came out swinging, I thought, in State of the Union. Like
shipping from China and other places have gone up 5-10-fold in the last year, according to small businesses who have to pay that transfer cost and add it to their retail prices. And they get the heat from the consumers. The small businesses, they walk in the stores, they get the heat from the consumers, but the real culprits are way up on the hierarchy there, including those shipping cartels, which somehow the Antitrust Department, the Justice Department, has never gotten around to investigating and prosecuting under the antitrust laws.
Yeah, they're not able to. The shipping companies have been excluded. So Congress passed a law maybe about a month ago to try to re-regulate the global shipping alliances, but we still need to reform the law so that the antitrust laws can be applied to the major shipping alliances. And that hasn't been done yet, though Biden has sort of called on Congress to do that. But that's an important piece of the puzzle here. Like, the Federal Maritime Commission, Federal Trade Commission just don't have the authority to take this on.